Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu began his sixth term in office late last month with a platform that includes expanding the Jewish presence throughout the Holy Land with increased settlements in the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank. In the coming weeks, officials from the Biden administration, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, have scheduled trips to Israel for meetings with the Prime Minister. What else can we expect from Netanyahu's return to power with a governing coalition that has been described as the most conservative in the country's history? Well, here with me to discuss this and more is Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News, coming to us now from Jerusalem. Chris, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Tony, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, sir, and Happy New Year to you as well. All right, the Prime Minister campaigned and was democratically elected on the policy of advancing and developing settlements in all parts of the land of Israel. And as I made reference, this new governing coalition has been described as the most conservative in the country's history. Is that accurate?
I think that is accurate, Tony. It is most conservative, and it's a combination of the Likud party, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party with over 30 seats, and then four religious parties, which make up his 64-seat coalition. It's very conservative. It's also very religious. And so I think we're going to see some perhaps confrontations, and we already have. Just a few days ago, the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he went up on the Temple Mount. It was a 13-minute visit. And believe it or not, that sparked an emergency session of the UN Security Council. We did a story on that today in CBN News. And I think that kind of confrontation, I think, is going to be something that may mark this government in relations to the international community, with places like the UN and the U.S. administration.
That's interesting, Chris, because that is a sharp contrast with the previous administration there in Israel, which was more, I would say, seeking to be compliant with the U.S. policy, as opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to be like the Energizer Bunny. I mean, he just keeps going, and I think he is in much better position to drive policy than I think a Biden administration when it comes to that part of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And the former government, led by first Naftali Bennett and then Yair Lapid, really was in many ways sort of in lockstep with the Biden administration, particularly on matters like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yair Lapid, for the first time in a number of years, was an Israeli prime minister who called for a two-state solution. Compliant, I think, is a good word, a good term of how the former government worked with the Biden administration. And I think this government, Benjamin Netanyahu, no stranger, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, and worked with several U.S. presidents, as well as President Biden as a vice president, and certainly as a U.S. senator. I think he's going to be much more willing to be confrontational, but also, trying to do that in a diplomatic way. But I think he's going to, with this government, really take steps that will may not please the current occupant of the White House.
Two things that I have read that really stick out to me. One, in the confrontational role, is the new governing coalition taking on the courts, the Supreme Court there in Israel, which has kind of been left-leaning. That's not radical in terms of taking on the court. We've seen that here in the United States and how the court steers things. But then also on the diplomatic side, to counter the United States in this pursuit of a deal with Iran, that there is negotiations of normalizing, actually an agreement with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations there. Tell us about those two things.
Well, two things, Tony. First of all, on judicial reform, some people are calling what the Likud is asking for, and one of the justice minister is part of the Likud party, and he's calling for judicial reform. Some are calling it here the end of democracy. However, others argue that what they're doing is trying to rebalance what had been not only left-leaning, but really the judicial arm of the government here had really been independent of any executive oversight. And so that's what they're trying to bring back to a balance. For example, many times the justices would select their own successors. And so that's why one thing the Likud actually ran on judicial reform. The other thing on terms of, rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, that's something that Netanyahu said was one of his main goals, even before the election, was that he would want to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. I was talking to someone earlier today on Background, and they were saying that really the difficulty for Saudi Arabia coming into the Abraham Accords isn't Israel, but the U.S. And they want to know, they're kind of leery of how the U.S. would respond to that. And as you know, for the last couple of years, it's been a very tense, fractured relationship between the White House, the Biden White House, and Saudi Arabia. So I think that's actually something that maybe Israel can broker between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and perhaps bring them back into, or not back, but actually for the first time into the Abraham Accords, which would be a game changer here in the Middle East.
Fascinating to see all of this unfold there in the Middle East. I mean, 10 years ago, you never would have envisioned this, but Iran is really kind of pushing many of these predominantly Muslim countries into a friendly posture with Israel. Chris, we got 30 seconds left. How should Christians be praying for Israel right now?
Well, certainly pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for wisdom for Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a lot on his plate. He has a very, as you said, conservative administration right now. He needs wisdom how to deal with that. I would also pray for the people of Iran, Tony. You know, their revolution has been going on over 100 days now. Could 2023 be the time when the regime actually falls? That would be a huge game changer for the Middle East and the world. So those people certainly need prayer.
Yes, and a government in the United States that would back them up, those who are seeking freedom. It's good to see that Israel will be backing up those looking for freedom. I hope America will do the same. Chris Mitchell, always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony.